North Korea's military might on display. The government says it's ready to defend itself, even with nuclear weapons, against any aggression by the United States. So, is the Korean Peninsula headed for war? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. Now, tension on the Korean Peninsula has increased since President Donald Trump threatened to act against North Korea's continued missile tests and nuclear ambitions. There have been concerns that Pyongyang is getting ready to launch another nuclear or missile test. And on Saturday, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un watched as his military put on a large parade that featured what some are calling new intercontinental missiles. So what does this all mean for the region that's already on edge? We'll put those questions to our guests in a moment. But first, Craig Gleeson has the latest from Seoul.
It's a chance for North Korea and leader Kim Jong-un to show the world some muscle. Military specialists keep a close eye on Pyongyang's military parades for clues about developments in the North's capabilities. And today, they were not disappointed. First came submarine-launched ballistic missiles, armed with new technology. And the new Pukgunsung-2, or Polaris, medium-range missiles, never before seen in public. But what took most by surprise was the public unveiling of an apparently new intercontinental ballistic missile. There are fears that the North could develop a nuclear warhead small enough to fit it and strike US soil. It all comes on the biggest day of the year for North Koreans, a time to celebrate the country's identity. But this year, the Day of the Sun is coming amid growing international fears of North Korea's nuclear threat and rising tensions between Washington, D.C. and Pyongyang.
If the United States wages reckless provocation against us, our revolutionary power will instantly counter it with an annihilating strike, and we will respond to full-out war with full-out war, and to nuclear war with our style of nuclear strike warfare.
The United States and South Korea have been conducting war games off the coast, which the North sees as practice for an invasion. US President Donald Trump has also been tweeting on the issue, saying that the North is looking for trouble.
You have two of the most unpredictable people on the world stage facing off against each other. You have armed armadas in position, and you have 11,000, reportedly, pieces of artillery aimed at Seoul. It's an explosive situation. The question is, how will it be resolved?
Craig Gleeson, Seoul for Inside Story.
So far this year, North Korea has fired at least 7 missiles. In January, Kim Jong-un said North Korea was in the final stage of preparing to test launch an intercontinental ballistic missile during his New Year address. The following month, it test-fired a new type of surface-to-surface medium-range ballistic missile in the western province of North Pyongyang. In March, North Korea launched 4 ballistic missiles. They're believed to be an exercise targeting US military bases in Japan. And the most recent test happened on April the 5th, when North Korea fired a missile into the sea off its eastern coast. Well, let's bring in our guests. In Beijing, Einar Tangen is a China analyst and an independent advisor to the Chinese government on economic development issues. In Busan, South Korea, Robert Kelly, Professor of Political Science and Diplomacy at Busan National University. And in Singapore, Graham Ong-Webb, Research Fellow in the Institute of Defence and Strategic Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to this edition of Inside Story. Robert, could I begin with you in Busan in South Korea? What's the atmosphere there like amongst South Koreans? Are they concerned, rattled, worried?
This is a little bit scarier than past war crises. These happen every few years. I still don't think that South Koreans take it as seriously as the international media does. The American media particularly seems to take these very seriously when they occur. The South Koreans have been living under the North Korean gun now for 60 years, so I don't think they get rattled by this much anymore. If you actually look at the Korean news, they're spending a lot of time talking about the Korean presidential debates, the Korean post-impeachment presidential elections coming up next month. The sort of regular coverage. There's not a great deal about it. There's more than usual, I would argue. I think people are more aware of it than in the past, but it's not like what you see in the international media, no.
Well, let's go over to Beijing and Einar Tangen there, who you saw in Craig Leeson's report. Good to have you on the programme, Einar. China's position and words on the issue have been markedly different in recent times. What does this really tell us about sort of China's position towards North Korea? Is it shifting?
Well, obviously there are some new flies in the ointment, and Donald Trump is one of them. You have two very unpredictable people, and Beijing is sitting on the sidelines hoping that they will come to something reasonable. Obviously, there have been some new developments from the Chinese side. They have canceled flights without comment from Air China into North Korea. They have issued a statement saying quite plainly, we do not have any treaty obligation to come to the aid of a North Korea seeking to become a nuclear power. They also have cut down by all of the coal that they were previously buying from North Korea. That is 1/3 of the cold hard cash reserves that the DPRK was earning each year. So yes, there has been a very marked change.
In terms of the diplomacy and the expertise that is required by China, as you say, they seem to be stuck in the middle between a US and a US president they're still trying to measure up to and try to find out what he's all about, and a North Korea, you might say, the devil that they already know rather than anything else. So they're stuck between this pit of insecurity.
Yes, they are, and it's a very unusual situation for China to be in. This is a smaller neighbor. They have been trying desperately over the years to try to get the DPRK to embrace some sort of economic revision. Quite frankly, they've been pointing to their own system. They have offered aid. They have built railway stations, all sorts of economic zones, and yet they remain empty. In fact, those who perilously get close to the Chinese government end up sometimes at the other end of an anti-aircraft gun. So very, very difficult to read. One of the things most people internationally don't understand is that Pyongyang fears and hates China actually more than the U.S. It has always been their theory that China was trying to establish control over South Korea, and there has been as much bitterness in the relationship as anything else. For instance, Xi Jinping has not yet met the leader of the DPRK since he came to power, despite having met 3 times with the South Korean president, who is now, unfortunately, looks like going off to jail. So you have this situation, and every time Xi Jinping seems to get near a microphone that is talking on international issues or important relationships, young Kim decides that this is an opportune time to light off a missile.
Okay, let's move over to Graham on Webb. We'll talk about the military aspect of what's going on in that region in a moment, but it comes after, Graham, the US's intent, you might say, in terms of what we've seen recently in Syria and in Afghanistan just a few days ago, in terms of bombings and missile launches. So one wonders what sort of message the United States is sending just in those launches rather than the flotilla of military naval vessels that are on their way to the area.
I think the gist of the message coming from the Americans right now is that they are not bluffing. As to whether they are bluffing, the next few days will give us that answer. But in the run-up to what's been going on, yes, certainly the reprisal against Syria for the chemical weapons attack against its civilians, and the reprisal against the Afghanistan government or the Afghanistan authorities for sponsoring Islamic State as a terrorist group, certainly are messages that are being telegraphed over to North Korea saying that we will use an inordinate amount of force, destructive force, to as a reprisal or to take out your military capabilities because they threaten our national security.
If you do see that as a message, then Robert Kelly, can I come back to you? Because there have been in the past a way of communicating between North and South Korea, and those lines of communication have been, to my understanding, become very strained over the last few months, if not the last 18 months, 2 years. How do you see those backdoor conversations right now? If North Korea is concerned about the United States, are they in any shape or form communicating that to the South?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. Under there were 2 liberal presidents in South Korea from 1997 to 2008, and there was actually a great deal of communication then. Under the succeeding two conservative presidents, a lot of that has been eliminated. There is sort of a great deal of sort of rumor out there that there are backdoor channels between North and South, but there's no sort of overt conversation at this point. I mean, there is sort of on technical issues at the DMZ zone, but there's no sort of open conversation. And if there was, it would be huge news in South Korea. Right? There's also sort of hints that the North Koreans sort of talk to South Korea through the United States at the United Nations and stuff like that. But again, there's sort of like nothing really that's sort of like well established above board, sort of track one. If anything, it's sort of track two going through maybe sort of like a third party embassy that is both in Seoul and Pyongyang.
I mean, you alluded to it at the beginning of your conversation. Einar Tangen has also mentioned it. I mean, Seoul has had its own domestic worries, the whole issue over the presidential's impeachment. How much has Seoul taken its eye off the ball when it comes to dealing with North Korea, dealing with its missile launches, dealing with its rhetoric that comes from Pyongyang?
Certainly, South Korea has been in political stasis basically since October when the scandal broke, what they call Che-gate, which is what brought down the president. When there's a new South Korean president in May, after May 9, things should be a lot clearer because then you at least have sort of formal policy direction from the top. In terms of defense and deterrence, though, a lot of that stuff is already sort of baked in. South Koreans and the Americans have been practicing and drilling together for a long time, right? So there's no sense that sort of South Korean security is actually at risk because they're lacking a head of state, a formally elected head of state. The real issue is, I think, what you're sort of pushing at, which is that are the South Koreans actually sort of diplomatically involved in this, right? If this really starts to spin out of control, can the acting president actually speak with genuine political legitimacy? And there's just never really been a situation like this before in South Korea. So nobody really knows. I would actually say no. I would actually say that this is one of the biggest problems that President Trump faces if he wants to bomb North Korea, is that he would actually want to get the South Koreans on board. And it's not clear if an acting president who never got elected, who's not particularly popular, could actually assent to that or reject it with any kind of popular legitimacy. At the very least, if the United States is going to attack North Korea, it has to wait another month.
Indeed, and Graham, the reason that, as Robert would say, they'd have to wait another month. Firstly, you've got the vice president in the region already speaking to regional leaders, both in South Korea and Japan, and also there is a UN Security Council meeting at the end of April, which is to deal with North Korea. Again, elements for later on in this conversation. But can I just bring you in that the US hasn't taken its eye off Pyongyang, and it wouldn't take its eye off when the issue of nuclear or even chemical weapons is mentioned, because it's been alluding to the same sort of thing in Syria and Iran. So America, in some shape or form, has continued to focus on North Korea, and how important is it then to make sure that their military supports that, you might say, focus at this moment in time, because it has both bases in South Korea and in Japan? Well,
the focus is quite clear. It is North Korea. I mean, coming back to the strategic messaging we were talking about earlier, you know, there's a lot to be read out of what happened with the Tomahawk salvo against the missile, the air base in Syria. It alludes to a range of things. I mean, the focus is North Korea primarily in terms of the nuclear threat, but it is not being taken off the table yet that there are other potential risks to be had from the North Korean side of things. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe alluded to the concern over a sarin gas attack from a medium-range ballistic missile being launched and hurled over into Japan. So the attack against Syria has several messages about how the Americans are reading the situation and how they understand what North Korea might bring to bear in a military crisis that spins out of control. I mean, North Korea has at its disposal potentially nuclear weapons. It's not quite clear whether they are operational yet. We have different views on this and different factual arguments for and against that. Chemical weapons has been a concern for quite some time, and this is something that could be brought to bear. And I think nothing is being taken for granted at this stage as to what the North Koreans may possibly do over the next few days. If they feel pushed into a corner that they have to act in some way. I mean, the Carl Vinson steaming off into the Korean Peninsula is creating pressure, and that pressure hopefully will work in a manner which it's intended to, which is to get the North Koreans to move away from the brink. But, you know, it could easily go the other way.
It's quite perhaps bizarre that we're at this particular moment in time in history when you might say the United States has a history of conflict, whether it be Afghanistan and Iraq in recent times, historically Vietnam and Korea. It knows the region well. It's learnt, hopefully, some sort of lessons from those deployments. How do you think, Robert, I know you're smiling, I mean, I wonder militarily, how do you think the United States is thinking about its deployments and its regional alliances?
Well, pardon me. Okay, the reason I was smiling is because the United States is a superpower that has the luxury of not learning. So we make the same mistakes in Iraq that we made in Vietnam. The United States American military options in the region with North Korea are really, really limited. So actually America's sort of experience with warfare, for example, since 9/11 or even in the 1990s, I just don't actually think that it really applies here terribly well. There are a lot of reasons why striking North Korea would be a catastrophe, not the least of which is that it would take a long time because the North Koreans have been tunneling since the Korean War when we bombed them very heavily. They've been tunneling ever since in preparation for another air attack, which means any airstrike on North Korea would take days, if not weeks. It would look an awful lot like a war. It would almost certainly drag the Chinese in. We don't know what the Chinese-North Korean red lines are for their alliance. If China got involved, then you're looking at a really serious shooting war. Once the airstrikes lasted more than a couple of days, the North Koreans were putting human shields up around sites. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why the lessons of American conflict in the last several decades really just don't apply here. The military options are just terrible, which is why ultimately I think that, today when that NBC report was refuted and Reuters reported that, that the Trump people have come to maximal pressure as their preferred solution. I mean, that's what basically the United States has been saying since the Bush administration, which is sort of the status quo.
Well, let's just take a little pause. I just want to give our international viewers an idea of sort of the geography of what we're talking about and how far these missiles that North Korea has developed can reach. Of course, from North Korea, they can reach, obviously, Japan, much of Asia-Pacific, and push themselves over to, of course, Canada, Alaska, and parts of the US. For the moment, Einar Tangen, I suppose if you're a Chinese military expert, you're looking at what North Korea has and what it's been targeting or could target through its recent missile tests would be locations possibly in South Korea or in Japan. Would that be a correct analysis?
Yes, that's correct. They don't have the capabilities at this point to push into any kind of serious target in the United States. Firing a missile at Alaska would only invite destruction with absolutely very little to gain. So from the Chinese side, they're very interested in what's going on. But in today's parade, you'll notice that they were making sure everyone knew that they had tracked vehicles. This is very important because they don't have a lot of roads. This means that they're going to have a scoot and shoot capability that will take them beyond the kind of known areas. And also that these are self-contained. They had a number of advanced rocket designs showing 3-stage ballistic missiles. These are all indications that they should be taken very seriously. But remember, the U.S. and neither the U.S. or China is willing to wait until they have a fully developed ICBM delivery system and a portable nuclear bomb that can be put on it. That is not in the cards. At some point, something has to give. China would like to see it happen at the negotiating table, 6-party talks, as they said, before things become irreversible.
Sure.
From the U.S. side, it's not clear. In the bombing in Afghanistan and also in Syria, these were actions without necessarily any kind of end game strategy involved. And this is what people are concerned about. You should also be concerned because the communications between China and the U.S. are not the way they should be. At this point in time, with a State Department that is not fully manned, with new people involved, with Jared Kushner seemingly in control of the China agenda, it's very difficult to see how they have the means and methods to communicate effectively. This is why Xi Jinping, I believe, is calling directly to Donald Trump. It's the only way to know that his message is getting through.
OK, well, let's move away slightly from military to the politics and sanctions, because Graham on Webb, I just want to bring you in here, because it's not just China that's concerned. Japan and South Korea, ASEAN countries are very concerned in your neck of the woods as well. And they have, for a time, been trying to communicate those concerns in some shape or form to North Korea. Malaysia hasn't got very good relations at the moment with the recent incident of Kim Jong-un's brother being killed at the international airport. How do you see the ASEAN or Asia-Pacific countries that have a vested interest dealing with North Korea or communicating their concerns to North Korea?
That's a very good question. There has been an all-round concern within the region among states here in Southeast Asia about the implications of what is going to pan out or what may pan out in Northeast Asia vis-a-vis the North Korean quagmire. We haven't seen any clear articulations of those concerns yet. I've come across chatter about it. But I think over the next few weeks, depending on how things pan out, at least in the next week with regard to Carl Vincent's presence in the peninsula, there will be some sort of, cohesive or concerted position on the stakes, so to speak, and ASEAN will clearly create some pressure through existing mechanisms with its Northeast Asian counterparts to exhaust the other levers, if you like, diplomatic and economic levers. But that remains to be seen. I'm particularly concerned about the next 1 week, and ASEAN really hasn't stepped up yet to say anything. But yes, you're right, there are concerns. The missile ranges do cover the good swath of Southeast Asia. We have some facilities here in the region. I won't be specific about that actually provide support to the 7th Fleet. And there are clear repercussions about this support. And ASEAN has to come in very quickly to say something very clear and very firm about this, because we need to come to the negotiating table and we need to talk again.
Well, let's just bring in Einar very quickly, because when we talk about putting the squeeze on North Korea, China has done that certainly last month with refusing to accept coal shipments, which are a huge money train, you might say, for North Korea to keep their economy going, which is in line with UN sanctions. And Robert, I know you're nodding your head. I'll bring you in here as well in a moment. Let's just get the general reaction about China's dealing with sanctions and how North Korea would react if it was pushed too far, if you squeeze the North Korean economy too much. That's something that China doesn't want to see its people desperate.
No, they don't. I mean, this idea of regime change has not worked anywhere so far in the world, and it's not going to work in North Korea. If you think simply taking out Kim Jong-un is going to solve things, I think you're decidedly wrong, and that is the Chinese view. They're trying to have this tightrope. They know that North Korea is wedded to this idea of having nuclear arms as a guarantee of its sovereignty and that it will be left alone. The best way for everything to be resolved at this point is, yes, trade, but there needs to be an understanding between the U.S., China, and the DPRK and South Korea about what the future lies. China's concerns are about the troops and the new missile deployments, especially THAAD, that are going in South Korea. The way to diffuse this is to have one country or the other guarantee the sovereignty of the DPRK. That could be China, it could be the U.S. Okay. But if any such thing were to happen, it would have to be at least a four-party contract.
Okay, I just need to bring in Robert Kelly very briefly for a final comment, really, because if we are moving towards the scene of politics and diplomacy, we have to also look to the end of the month and the UN Security Council, how North Korea would react from any sort of adjudication against it will be very important.
Well, they almost certainly will reject it, as they have in the past. I mean, if there's anything we know about North Korea, it's that they put their foot on the accelerator when they're challenged. I would be very surprised if North Korea takes any kind of, UN sanction or reprimand. Seriously, I would argue that a lot of this comes down, when it comes to sanction from the UN, a lot of this really comes down to whether or not China is willing to really enforce them. How much will China close the gate? Will they go after North Korean money in Chinese banks and things like that? This really, in my opinion, this really is not much of a multilateral issue. Now, this is really about whether or not China is going to pressure North Korea or not. I think that's what Trump is doing with the Moab, the bomb, and the Carl Vincent battle group, right? All this is not really to bomb North Korea. That's just too risky. This is really to signal China, to bluff China.
Well, we shall see. Well, indeed, we shall see what happens in the coming days and weeks. For the moment there, gentlemen, we have to leave it. But thank you for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. Einar Tangen in Beijing, Robert Kelly in Busan, South Korea, and Graham Ong-Webb in Singapore. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. You can, of course, watch the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail Rahman, and all of the Inside Story team, thanks very much for your time and your company.